The story begins in the late 1930s, as Europe drifted closer to the edge of catastrophe. When Adolf Hitler unleashed war upon the continent in September 1939, the Nazi regime already understood one terrible truth. War could not be sustained without labor. Endless armies, vast weapons factories, and sprawling fortifications demanded more workers than Germany could ever supply on its own. But Hitler had a solution, a brutal one. As his armies marched east and west, they did not just claim land. They claimed people. Men, women, and even children were torn from their homes, transported across borders, and forced to labor for the Nazi state. At first, it seemed to some Germans like a practical necessity. Germany's unemployment of the 1930s had been transformed into full wartime production. Millions of German men were drafted into the Wehrmacht. Someone had to take their place in the factories, on the farms, and in the workshops. And so, the solution became clear: enslave the conquered. By 1940, the machine of exploitation was already in motion. From Poland, from France, from the Low Countries, waves of forced laborers were taken into Germany. Some were captured prisoners of war. Others were civilians rounded up in villages at gunpoint. Entire trains were filled not with soldiers, but with farmers, craftsmen, teachers, and students, ordinary people whose lives had suddenly been stolen. But what happened next would change everything. The Nazi vision of work as control, the Nazis saw labor as more than economic necessity. To them, it was domination, punishment, and ideology wrapped into one. Hitler and his planners often spoke of a new Europe where conquered nations would serve as the manpower of the German Reich. To the Nazis, Slavic peoples, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians were subhuman. They were not just forced to work, but expected to be worked to death. In contrast, Western Europeans, such as the French and Belgians, were often used in skilled industries but still faced harsh conditions. Labor became a weapon. The Nazis could weaken conquered nations by removing their strongest workers. They could control populations through terror, by making it clear that resistance meant deportation. And they could fuel their war machine with a constant stream of human bodies. The scale of enslavement, the numbers were staggering. By the height of the war, over 13 million forced laborers were working for Nazi Germany. This made up nearly 1/4 of the entire labor force. Entire German cities thrived on the backs of the enslaved. Factories in Essen, Munich, and Berlin ran on their sweat. Farms across Bavaria and Saxony harvested food with their hands. Some workers wore identifying patches, OSD for Eastern laborers, a cruel badge of inferiority. Others were hidden behind factory walls, unseen by most Germans. But whether visible or not, their presence shaped everyday life in the Reich. Imagine the scene: a young French student dragged onto a train after a Nazi raid in Paris. A Polish farmer, separated from his family, shipped across the border to toil in a steel plant. A Soviet prisoner of war, starving, shivering, and pushed to carry loads heavier than his broken body could bear. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the foundation of Nazi power. The human cost of expansion, each military victory brought more victims. When Poland fell in 1939, it provided the first wave. After France surrendered in 1940, hundreds of thousands more were taken. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 opened the gates to an even darker chapter. Millions of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war were enslaved, many never to return. This system was not an accident. It was meticulously organized. Bureaucrats in Berlin drew up quotas. Governors in occupied territories were ordered to supply bodies as if they were raw materials. Trains were scheduled not just for coal and oil, but for human cargo. The war machine needed steel, oil, tanks, and guns. But above all, it needed hands to build them. And those hands were taken by force. An uneasy reality inside Germany for ordinary Germans. The presence of foreign laborers became part of daily life. Farmers grew used to Polish or Ukrainian workers tending their fields. Housewives in small towns sometimes had young women from the East working in their kitchens under strict Nazi surveillance. And yet, there was tension. Nazi propaganda painted these laborers as both essential and dangerous. useful to the war effort, but always outsiders who could not be trusted. Strict rules separated them from German society. They lived in guarded camps, often surrounded by barbed wire. Contact with Germans, especially intimate contact, was forbidden and punished with cruelty. Still, behind the propaganda and fear, many Germans knew the truth. Their wartime comfort was built on the suffering of others. The calm before the storm as the war dragged on. The system grew harsher. What began as forced recruitment soon became mass deportations. Entire towns in occupied Eastern Europe could wake to the sound of boots and barking dogs as men with rifles dragged families away. Mothers clutched children, fathers begged for mercy, but the trains did not stop. Germany's labor hunger was insatiable. With every battle, with every loss of German soldiers, the demands grew. Soon, what had been exploitation turned into annihilation. And yet, in those early years, many in Germany believed this system would secure victory. Factories hummed, tanks rolled out, and supplies flowed. The Reich seemed unstoppable, but deep beneath the order and efficiency was a rot, a dependence on brutality so vast it could not last forever. Because the more the Nazis relied on forced labor, the more fragile their empire became. And in time, the same system that had built their power would also help to bring it crashing down. Hitler's vision of exploitation. Ideology meets industry. It is one thing to wage war. It is another to reimagine the world so completely that every man, woman, and child becomes a cog in your vision. This was Adolf Hitler's ambition. He did not merely want to conquer land. He wanted to reorder life itself. And at the heart of that reordering stood labor. From the earliest days of the Nazi movement, Hitler and his inner circle spoke of living space, Lebensraum. To them, Germany's future depended on the conquest of Eastern Europe, where millions of Slavs, Jews, and other undesirables would be reduced to slaves, working for the Aryan master race. To Hitler, forced labor was not a temporary solution. It was the core of the Nazi empire's future. But what happened next would reveal just how deeply ideology and industry became intertwined. Ideology as justification, the Nazis cloaked their exploitation in the language of destiny and race. Joseph Goebbels, the master propagandist, declared that Germans had the right to demand sacrifices from inferior peoples. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, openly wrote that Slavic populations would be worked until they withered away. This was not only about economics, it was about power and humiliation. By reducing entire nations to laborers, the Nazis reinforced their twisted hierarchy. Germans were rulers, Western Europeans were subordinates, and Eastern Europeans were slaves. For the Jewish people, the equation was even more horrifying. Their labor was temporary. They were forced to work until exhaustion, then destined for extermination. Industry seized opportunity, while ideology gave the Nazis a moral excuse for their cruelty. Industry saw something else: profit. German corporations, many of which still exist today, lined up to benefit from the flood of free labor. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens partnered with the Nazi state to employ thousands of forced workers. Camps were built near factories so that laborers could be marched directly from their barracks to their workstations. Every bomb dropped on London, every tank that rolled across Russia, was touched by these hands. Forced labor was not hidden at the edges of the Nazi economy. It was its beating heart. The SS and the business of slavery, the SS, Himmler's paramilitary empire, played a central role. They managed the camps, controlled deportations, and provided contracts for laborers to industries. The SS turned human lives into commodities, measured not in dignity, but in work hours. A Soviet prisoner might be worth 3 months of heavy labor before starvation claimed him. A young Polish woman, if kept alive, might serve in agriculture for 2 years. To the SS, these were not human beings. They were calculations. The horror lay not only in the cruelty, but in the cold efficiency with which it was organized. The General Plan Ost, the blueprint of enslavement in 1941, as Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, against the Soviet Union, Nazi planners began drawing up the General Plan Ost, a blueprint for Eastern Europe's future. The plan envisioned the expulsion, enslavement, and extermination of up to 50 million people. The fertile lands of Ukraine would feed Germany. Its people would become serfs, stripped of identity and culture. Cities like Warsaw and Kyiv would shrink into little more than labor depots, while new German settlements spread across the east. The Nazi dream was not just military conquest, it was a civilization built on slavery. Propaganda for the German people to keep the German public on board. Propaganda framed forced labor as both natural and beneficial. Posters showed smiling French and Dutch workers helping Germany. Radio broadcasts insisted that these foreign workers were treated fairly, housed well, and paid modest wages. The truth, of course, was far darker. Most were underfed, beaten, and robbed of their freedom. They slept in overcrowded barracks, worked long hours, and lived in constant fear of punishment. But many Germans believed, or chose to believe, the lies. After all, their shelves were stocked, their factories productive, and their soldiers supplied. Why question the source? The human face of exploitation, yet behind every statistic was a life. A teenage boy from Ukraine, promised factory work, but instead sent to dig trenches until his hands bled. A French mechanic who once repaired bicycles in Paris, now repairing German tanks that would destroy his own homeland. A young Polish mother, forced into agriculture, her child left behind with grandparents she might never see again. Each carried their own story of fear, longing, and survival. A system that fed on war. The more Germany conquered, the more its appetite grew. The Nazi economy became addicted to cheap labor. Victories in the field no longer brought only land and resources. They brought people. Every new campaign swelled the camps and filled the trains. Every new occupied city became another hunting ground. Soon, the Reich could not imagine victory without the hands of millions of slaves. But this system carried a hidden weakness. For while it gave Germany power in the short term, it also made the regime increasingly dependent on brutality. And dependence on brutality has a way of backfiring. The war was far from over, and darker chapters of forced labor were yet to come. From conquered lands to captive hands, the recruitment of millions, it began quietly. At first, the Nazis pretended that their need for workers could be solved through voluntary recruitment. Posters appeared in the streets of Paris, Brussels, and Warsaw, showing clean barracks, decent meals, and smiling men in factory uniforms. The message was simple: come to Germany, earn good wages, and help rebuild Europe. For some, the promise was tempting. The Depression years had left many hungry, and in occupied lands jobs were scarce. A few boarded the trains willingly, clutching small suitcases and believing they were headed for steady work. But what happened next would shatter that illusion. Voluntary recruitment becomes coercion. By 1940, enthusiasm had dried up. Workers who returned home, thin, ragged, and traumatized, spread the truth. Germany's opportunity was slavery. Few were willing to go. The Nazis responded the only way they knew how: through fear. Quotas were set. Local mayors and police were ordered to provide numbers. When not enough volunteers came forward, roundups began. In France, men were seized in cinemas, cafes, and train stations. In Poland, German troops surrounded villages at dawn, driving entire groups into trucks. In the Soviet Union, where millions of civilians were under Nazi occupation, the policy was brutal and immediate. Anyone strong enough to work was taken. The illusion of choice was gone. What remained was terror. The machinery of deportation, the process was chilling in its efficiency. Identification, local collaborators, or German officials created lists of eligible workers: young men, healthy women, even teenagers. Seizure, raids swept through neighborhoods. Families screamed as fathers were dragged from homes. Mothers clung to their children. Young men fled into forests to avoid capture. Transport, those taken were herded into cattle cars, the same trains used to haul livestock. Conditions were filthy, water scarce, and air suffocating. Journeys lasted days, sometimes weeks. Distribution: upon arrival in Germany, laborers were allocated like raw materials. Some went to farms, others to factories, others to mines. Families were torn apart, never to reunite. Every step stripped away dignity. By the time they arrived at their destinations, many were already broken in body and spirit. The patch of shame once inside the Reich. Forced laborers were marked. Nazis insisted that every worker wear a cloth badge sewn to their clothing. For Poles, it was a purple P. For Eastern workers, a bright patch reading OST, East. Jews carried the Star of David. These badges branded them as outsiders, as inferior. It meant they could be insulted, beaten, or arrested at will. It reminded them, every time they looked down, that they were prisoners, not free men and women. Numbers that stagger the imagination by the height of the war. Germany had imported more foreign workers than any empire in modern history. 2.8 million Poles, 2 million Soviet civilians, 1.5 million French workers, hundreds of thousands from Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans in total, more than 13 million people. Entire nations hollowed out, their strength stolen. It was as if whole generations had been uprooted and transplanted into the heart of Germany, not as citizens, but as slaves. Human stories in the midst of numbers behind each number lay a personal tragedy. In occupied Ukraine, a 17-year-old girl named Katia was taken from her family farm. Promised domestic work, she ended up in a munitions factory, her hands blistered from handling explosives. In Paris, Jacques, a young mechanic, was caught in a roundup outside a cafe. He was shipped to Germany, where he spent the next 4 years repairing Luftwaffe aircraft that would bomb his homeland. In Warsaw, entire families were separated during street raids. Fathers sent to steel mills, mothers to farms, children left to starve. Their voices rarely reached the outside world, but they carried with them a shared memory of chains. Collaboration and resistance to the system depended not only on German power, but also on local collaboration. Some officials in occupied nations cooperated, either out of fear or for personal gain. Others resisted, hiding young men, forging documents, or helping families flee into the countryside. In France, the hated service du travail obligatoire, compulsory work service, drove thousands into hiding or into the arms of the resistance. In Poland and the Soviet Union, villagers dug underground shelters to protect their sons from deportation raids. Every act of resistance came at a cost. Entire communities faced reprisals if quotas were not met. Yet even in the shadow of terror, some defied the Nazi grip. The endless trains for Germans standing at railway stations, the sight of foreign workers became common. Trains rattled through the countryside, windows barred, faces pressed against the glass. These were not soldiers. They were the workforce of a new empire in chains. The trains never stopped. From 1940 until 1945, they ran day and night, pulling men and women from conquered lands into the heart of the Reich. The movement was so vast that it rivaled the supply lines of the German army itself. The Reich was not just a war machine. It was a machine of enslavement. A nation built on captivity by the early 1940s, Germany had transformed itself into a fortress powered by stolen labor. From farms to factories, from highways to weapons plants, the hands that built Hitler's war were not German. They were Polish, French, Ukrainian, Russian, Italian, Dutch, Belgian. They were the hands of millions who had no choice. And as the war grew bloodier, as German losses mounted, the demands only increased. The Reich was hooked on labor, addicted to bodies. And the deeper this addiction ran, the more desperate and brutal the system became. Factories of suffering. Inside the camps and work sites, the trains arrived in the dead of night. Doors slammed open. Guards with dogs shouted orders. The bewildered men and women, stiff from days in cattle cars, stumbled onto German soil. For many, this was their first glimpse of the Reich. Not grand boulevards or shining cities, but barbed wire, watchtowers, and barracks. This was the beginning of life inside the Nazi forced labor system. To outsiders, the word camp often suggests a single place. But in Nazi Germany, there were tens of thousands. Some were sprawling complexes run by the SS. Others were small satellite camps built beside factories, farms, and construction sites. All had one thing in common. They existed to squeeze the last ounce of labor from the people trapped inside. And what happened inside these camps turned ordinary work into daily torment. Arrival and processing. Upon arrival, workers were stripped of their belongings. Suitcases, jewelry, even family photographs were taken away. Many were forced to shower, not for hygiene, but for humiliation. Hair was cut short. Clothes were replaced with rough uniforms or old civilian rags stamped with patches. Prisoners were registered and sorted. The strong were sent to heavy labor, quarries, steelworks, weapons factories. The weak were often sent to farms or domestic service. Jews, Roma, and Soviet POWs frequently faced the harshest assignments, often little more than death sentences. From the first day, one fact was clear: these were not jobs. They were punishments. The range of work was staggering. Factories, giant industrial plants like Krupp and IG Farben swallowed thousands of laborers. In these factories, they forged steel for tanks, assembled aircraft, and produced chemicals for weapons. Construction. Thousands were sent to dig trenches, build fortifications, and construct Germany's vast network of military roads and bunkers. Agriculture. On German farms, laborers bent their backs over fields from dawn until dusk, harvesting food that would feed the Reich while they themselves went hungry. Mines and quarries. Perhaps the most brutal assignments. Underground mines choked with dust, quarries where workers hauled stone until their muscles gave out. Many never return alive. The hours were crushing. 12-hour shifts were common, sometimes longer. Breaks were short, meals meager. For every loaf of bread a German worker received, a foreign laborer got a crust. Conditions in the camp's life outside the workplace offered no relief. Barracks, overcrowded wooden huts, often housing hundreds. Damp in winter, stifling in summer. Vermin thrived. Disease spread unchecked. Food, rations were deliberately inadequate. Thin soup, stale bread, sometimes little more than potato peels. Starvation became part of daily existence. Hygiene, toilets were open pits, water scarce. Washing was rare. Lice and fleas spread typhus and other diseases. Punishment, guards ruled with whips, rifles, and fear. A missed quota could mean a beating. Falling asleep at work might mean death. Survival was not guaranteed. In some camps, mortality rates rivaled those of concentration camps. The line between forced labor and extermination blurred. The SS and the overseer's oversight varied from place to place. Some camps were run directly by the SS, their guards trained in cruelty. Others were managed by factory foremen who often treated laborers as disposable tools. But cruelty was constant. A dropped hammer, a broken machine, a sick day. Any of these could lead to savage beatings. In some cases, entire groups were punished for the mistake of one. Even ordinary Germans became overseers. Housewives supervising domestic workers, farmers directing Polish or Ukrainian field hands. All carried the power of punishment. The system infected everyday life, spreading its brutality beyond the barbed wire. The psychological weight, the physical suffering was crushing, but so too was the mental torment. Prisoners lived with constant uncertainty. Would they be sent to another camp tomorrow? Would they ever see family again? At night, exhausted workers lay awake listening to coughs, cries, and the shuffle of rats in the barracks. Some whispered memories of home. Others no longer spoke at all. Silence, for many, became the only form of resistance left. The factories of death, for some, forced labor was not meant to last. In camps like Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Mauthausen, labor was intertwined with extermination. Prisoners were worked until they collapsed, then replaced with new arrivals. The SS even calculated how much labor could be extracted before death, treating human beings like coal to be burned. The line between work camp and death camp was thin, often non-existent. The factories of suffering were also factories of death. glimpses of humanity, and yet, even here, humanity flickered. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread, sang quiet songs from home, or carved secret messages into barrack walls. A French worker might teach a Polish comrade a few words of his language. A Ukrainian girl might pass a smile to a fellow laborer, a reminder that they were still human in a system designed to erase them. These moments did not erase the horror, but they kept alive the smallest spark of hope. A machine that could not stop by 1943, as Germany suffered defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa, the demand for labor only grew. Qu'on multiplied. New transports arrived weekly. Even as the Reich weakened militarily, the labor machine expanded, feeding off the misery of millions. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Resistance grew. Sabotage spread in the factories, and whispers of liberation began to reach even the darkest camps. The empire of suffering was vast, but it was not eternal. Daily life in bondage, hunger, fear, and survival the days in the camps and work sites followed a rhythm of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. For the millions caught in the web of Nazi forced labor, life became a cycle of waking too early, working too long, and collapsing too late. There was no comfort, no privacy, no safety. Every sound, boots on gravel, dogs barking, the clang of a factory bell, carried the possibility of pain. And yet, amid this unending grind, men and women still struggled to hold on to the small pieces of humanity that the Reich tried so hard to strip away. But what happened next would show just how fragile survival could be. The morning routine the day often began before dawn. Guards stormed into barracks, shouting orders. Prisoners scrambled from thin straw mattresses, pulling on the same tattered clothes they had worn for weeks. The cold of winter mornings cut through the wooden huts, while in summer the air inside was suffocating. Roll call followed, sometimes lasting hours. Workers stood at attention as guards counted them again and again, punishing even the smallest error. Some collapsed before the day had even begun, fainting from hunger or illness, and were dragged away, their fate uncertain. Breakfast, if it came at all, was a crust of bread or a cup of thin, watery coffee substitute. It was barely enough to quiet the growling stomach, let alone fuel a day of back-breaking labor. The long workday, the shift stretched 12, sometimes 14 hours. Workers marched in groups to their assigned posts. Factories, farms, construction sites. In factories, the noise of machinery was deafening. Men and women stood at assembly lines, repeating the same movements endlessly, riveting, hammering, welding. The air stank of oil and smoke. On farms, the work was relentless, plowing fields, harvesting crops, milking cows. Laborers bent their backs in soil that was not their own, raising food they would never taste. In construction, workers hauled stone, poured concrete, and dug trenches. Every shovel of earth felt like a wound carved into the body. Breaks were short, often only a few minutes. Water was scarce. The body ran on little more than willpower. And still, quotas had to be met. A day's work judged too slow could mean beatings or worse. Hunger as a constant companion food was the greatest torment. Rations were deliberately small. A thin soup with barely any vegetables. A chunk of bread shared between several people. Occasionally, a smear of margarine or a slice of turnip. Workers burned thousands of calories a day, but consumed only a fraction. Starvation became visible in every face, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, bodies reduced to skin and bone. Hunger shaped everything. Men picked at scraps in garbage bins. Women stole potato peels from kitchens. Prisoners risked their lives to smuggle food, knowing discovery meant death. The hunger never left. Even in sleep, workers dreamed of bread. Fear as shadow if hunger weakened the body. Fear crushed the spirit. Fear of the guards, of punishment, of sudden deportation to another camp. Fear of illness, which often meant dismissal from work and a one-way trip to a death camp. Guards wielded fear as a tool. Whips cracked against backs. Dogs lunged at prisoners. Public beatings served as warnings. This is what happens if you resist. Even ordinary Germans in towns and villages reinforced that fear. Neighbors could denounce workers who stepped out of line. Police arrested laborers caught without papers. Escape was nearly impossible because every eye was trained to see them as outsiders. Survival strategies, and yet people adapted. To survive, they developed strategies, forming bonds. Prisoners shared food, took turns covering each other's shifts, or whispered encouragement. A slice of bread split between two could mean one more day of life. Clinging to memory. Some recited poems or prayers in their native languages. Others sang quiet lullabies at night, the songs of their childhood. Small acts of resistance. Workers intentionally slowed machines, misplaced tools, or damaged equipment. These acts were dangerous, but they gave a sense of control, however fleeting. Imagination. Many survived by dreaming of home, replaying the faces of parents, children, or lovers in their minds, as if holding on to memory could carry them through. Survival was not just about the body. It was about the will to remain human in a world determined to erase humanity. The role of women and women often faced double burdens. They worked long hours in factories or fields, then were forced into domestic service, cleaning German homes under constant watch. Many endured sexual violence, silenced by the threat of death. Children, too, were not spared. Teenagers were prime targets for labor drafts. Some as young as 12 or 13 were taken, especially in Eastern Europe. Their small hands were often used in delicate factory tasks, their young bodies driven beyond endurance. The sight of children in the camps was especially haunting. Thin legs carrying heavy buckets, small shoulders bent under sacks of coal. A generation robbed of childhood. Moments of despair, moments of hope in the bleakness, despair often overwhelmed. Some prisoners gave up entirely, collapsing at their workstations, refusing to rise again. For them, death seemed kinder than another day. But hope, fragile as it was, still flickered. A letter smuggled from home. A Red Cross package delivered against all odds. A rumor of advancing Allied armies. Each rumor, each whisper, became a lifeline. Hope did not erase the suffering, but it gave people the strength to wake up one more morning, to endure one more day. The fragile balance of survival, daily life, and bondage was not truly life. It was existence, narrow, brutal, and uncertain. Workers lived on the edge, where one mistake, one illness, or one unlucky glance from a guard could end it all. And yet, somehow millions endured. They endured hunger. They endured fear. They endured the stripping away of dignity, because the alternative, surrendering entirely, was worse. But the system was not finished with them. For as the Reich's need grew, new victims were added and cruelty deepened. The machinery of forced labor had no mercy, only appetite. Women, children, and the forgotten victims of forced labor. When we think of forced labor under the Nazis, we often picture young men dragged from their homes, sent to dig trenches or work in steel mills. And indeed, they made up a vast portion of the enslaved. But hidden in the shadows of history are the women, the children, and the countless invisible victims who bore burdens every bit as heavy and often more tragic. Their stories are quieter, harder to trace, but no less essential. For the Nazi system of exploitation reached into every corner of society. And what happened to these forgotten victims reveals the full cruelty of the regime. Women in bondage by 1942, as Germany's hunger for labor grew, women were increasingly targeted. Tens of thousands were taken from Poland, Ukraine, France, and other occupied territories. Factories. Women were placed on assembly lines, producing munitions, uniforms, or airplane parts. Their hands grew raw from repetitive work, their lungs filled with dust and chemicals. Agriculture. In rural Germany, women were forced into seasonal labor, harvesting crops, milking cows, cleaning barns. They worked from dawn until dusk under the gaze of overseers. Domestic service. Many young women were sent into German households as maids or nannies. They cooked, cleaned, and cared for children, all while living under constant surveillance. Any accusation of theft laziness, or improper behavior could land them back in the camps, or worse. For many women, forced labor came with another unspoken torment: sexual violence. Guards, overseers, and even civilians exploited their vulnerability. Pregnancies were common. In some camps, babies were killed at birth or taken away. In others, women were subjected to forced abortions. Silence surrounded these crimes. Few dared to speak, but the scars never left. The fate of children were not spared. Nazi officials believed young bodies could be molded for work just as easily as adults. Teenagers, especially boys, were prime targets. A 14-year-old from occupied Poland might be torn from his family and sent to a German farm. A 16-year-old Ukrainian girl might end up in a textile factory, working 14 hours a day. Younger children were sometimes deported with their mothers. Too small to work, they were neglected, starved, or abandoned in children's barracks where disease spread unchecked. Many did not survive. Orphans, the children of parents killed or deported, wandered villages in the east, easy prey for Nazi labor recruiters. Some were forced into camps like Auschwitz, where children were subjected to unimaginable horrors. Others worked quietly in German homes, scrubbing floors far from the eyes of the world. A childhood spent in servitude left deep scars. These children lost not only their families, but also their youth. The Roma and other unseen victims beyond Jews, Slavs, and Western Europeans, the Nazis targeted other groups often left out of mainstream memory. Roma, gypsies, thousands were enslaved in camps, forced into heavy labor before being deported to extermination centers. Disabled people, some were used briefly for simple tasks before being murdered under euthanasia programs. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, intellectuals, and dissidents across occupied Europe were thrown into camps, their labor extracted before execution. The forced labor system was not selective. It devoured anyone the Nazis deemed expendable. Layers of humiliation for women and children especially. Humiliation was a constant weapon. Women were mocked, degraded, and stripped of privacy. Children were told they were worthless, scolded if they cried, punished if they faltered. The Nazis sought not only to exploit their labor, but also to break their spirits. A woman who lost her child, a boy who forgot his mother's face. These were victories for the Reich. The struggle to endure, and yet, even among the forgotten, endurance remained. Mothers whispered lullabies to children in barracks, trying to keep alive fragments of culture and hope. Teenage boys stole food from fields to feed their younger siblings. Women in domestic service sometimes found small mercies, an extra slice of bread, a kind glance from a child in their care, that reminded them of their own lost families. Every act of survival was an act of defiance. Every life preserved was a victory, however small. The aftermath for the forgotten, when liberation came in 1945, these women and children did not simply step back into normal lives. Many returned home to find their families dead, their villages destroyed, their childhoods stolen. Women who had endured sexual violence often carried shame and silence for decades. Survivors of childhood labor grew up with memories of fear instead of play. For them, the war did not end in 1945. Its shadow followed them for the rest of their lives. Why their stories matter: history often remembers battles and generals. It remembers the tanks, the bombers, the leaders who signed treaties. But in the cracks of that history lie the stories of women scrubbing German floors, of children milking cows on foreign farms, of Roma families crushed by labor and silence. These stories remind us that war is not only fought on front lines. It is fought in kitchens, in fields, in factories, in the stolen years of the young and the powerless. And in the Nazi forced labor system, these forgotten victims carried burdens too heavy for history to ignore. Resistance in chains, small acts of defiance in the vast machinery of Nazi oppression. Forced laborers often seemed powerless. Stripped of freedom, beaten down by hunger, and watched by guards, open rebellion was nearly impossible. Yet even in chains, resistance found a way. Sometimes it was loud and deadly, sabotage that destroyed weapons or halted production. More often, it was quiet, hidden, and personal. Small acts that, together, became a defiance the Nazis could never fully crush. Sabotage from the inside factories powered much of the German war effort, and forced laborers were at the heart of production. Ammunition, trucks, aircraft parts, all passed through their hands. This gave them a dangerous opportunity. Workers in munitions plants sometimes filed bolts incorrectly, weakened casings, or deliberately left flaws invisible to the eye. Mechanics assigned to repair tanks forgot critical steps, ensuring breakdowns at the front. In aircraft factories, foreign workers added tiny errors that multiplied in flight, leading to failures far from the factory floor. Every defective bullet, every faulty engine, every sabotage plane was a strike against the Reich. But sabotage carried deadly risk. If discovered, punishment was swift: execution on the spot or transfer to brutal camps like Mauthausen, where survival was almost impossible. And still, workers risked it because even the smallest disruption felt like a victory. Acts of solidarity, not all resistance looked like sabotage. Sometimes it was as simple as helping the person beside you. Prisoners in labor camps shared scraps of bread, even when it meant going hungry themselves. Those with slightly better positions, like kitchen workers or clerks, smuggled food, medicine, or information to others. Older workers shielded children from the harshest tasks, taking the blows themselves. This solidarity gave strength. It whispered, "You are not alone, even here." In a world designed to dehumanize, every act of kindness was an act of rebellion. Preserving identity, the Nazis tried to strip forced laborers of their culture, their names, even their humanity. Yet people resisted in subtle, stubborn ways. Workers sang forbidden songs from their homelands softly under their breath. Children scratched their real names into wooden barracks walls. Prisoners spoke their native languages in secret, refusing to let German commands be their only voice. In some camps, prisoners secretly wrote diaries, carving memories onto scraps of paper or cloth. These fragments, hidden under floorboards or buried in the ground, would sometimes survive long after the war. Testimony to lives the Nazis tried to erase. Organized resistance, while many acts were individual, others were coordinated. In France, Poland, and the Netherlands, resistance groups infiltrated forced labor transports, forging documents to help young men escape conscription. Some attacked trains carrying deportees to Germany, freeing them before they reached the factories. Inside Germany, underground networks of foreign workers sometimes cooperated with local communists or anti-Nazi Germans, passing information to the Allies or organizing slowdowns in production. Though small compared to the vast Nazi system, these networks proved one thing. Even under the tightest control, resistance was never fully silenced. The courage to say no. There were moments when resistance was simply refusal. A group of Ukrainian women assigned to domestic service in Hamburg reportedly went on strike after being denied food. Beaten and threatened, they eventually returned to work, but their stand left a mark on the community around them. In occupied Poland, some young people burned their German labor summons rather than report for deportation. Many were caught and punished, but their refusal echoed through villages, inspiring others to resist in whatever ways they could. Even a single no, whispered in defiance, mattered. Resistance through survival, perhaps the most overlooked form of resistance, was survival itself. The Nazis wanted not only to exploit, but also to break their victims, physically, mentally, spiritually. Every man, woman, and child who endured, who lived to see liberation, was proof that the regime had failed to crush the human spirit. Survival was resistance. Holding on to life meant denying the Nazis their ultimate victory. The power of small acts, history often celebrates the great battles and daring uprisings. But in the forced labor camps and factories of Nazi Germany, the most powerful resistance sometimes took the smallest forms: a broken machine, a stolen loaf of bread, a song sung in secret. The Nazis could control bodies, but they could never fully control the will to resist. And in those small, everyday acts of defiance, forced laborers kept alive a flame of freedom that the Reich could never extinguish. The role of German industry. Profit from pain. When we picture the Nazi forced labor system, it is easy to imagine it as something hidden away in camps, far from everyday life. But the truth is more unsettling. Germany's economy, its factories, its farms, even its homes, was deeply tied to forced labor. This was not just a state project run by the SS. It was also a business enterprise where profit and ideology worked hand in hand. Behind every weapon on the front lines, every vehicle on the roads, and every loaf of bread on a German table, there were invisible hands. The hands of millions of enslaved men, women, and children. Industry at the heart of exploitation as the war dragged on. Germany faced a crisis. Millions of German men were sent to the army, leaving behind empty workshops and idle machines. To fill this gap, the Nazi regime turned to forced labor. By 1944, over 7 million foreign laborers were working inside Germany itself. Nearly every major industrial firm, Krupp, IG Farben, Siemens, Volkswagen, BMW, used forced laborers. Entire industries, from armaments to agriculture, depended on this captive workforce. Factories became extensions of the camp system. In many cases, camps were built right next to industrial plants, so prisoners could be marched directly from barracks to the production line. Krupp, the giant of steel and weapons. The Krupp family name had been tied to German steel and weapons for centuries. During World War II, their factories became a symbol of forced labor exploitation. Prisoners, drawn from across Europe, were pushed into steel mills and munitions plants. They worked with molten metal, heavy machinery, and explosives. Accidents were frequent. Safety was ignored. For Krupp, profit came first. After the war, Alfred Krupp, head of the company, was tried for crimes against humanity for his role in exploiting slave labor. IG Farben. Science turned to slavery. Another infamous name was IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced everything from synthetic rubber to explosives. It built a factory complex near Auschwitz, known as Monowitz or Auschwitz III. Tens of thousands of prisoners were marched from the Auschwitz camp to work in IG Farben's plants. Starved, beaten, and worked to exhaustion, they rarely survived more than a few months. For the company, it was a calculated system. Endless human replacements, endless production. Human lives became just another resource. Volkswagen and the automobile industry. Volkswagen, created in the 1930s as Hitler's People's Car project, relied heavily on forced labor during the war. Its factories shifted from producing cars to military vehicles and equipment. Thousands of foreign workers, including women and children, were brought in. Many lived in poor conditions, often in barracks near the plant. Later, survivors recalled hunger, long hours, and harsh discipline. The everyday German connection. It wasn't only giant corporations that profited. Ordinary German farmers, shopkeepers, and families relied on forced labor too. Farms across the Reich used laborers from Poland, Ukraine, and France to replace sons who had gone to war. Small workshops employed foreign workers, sometimes under official contracts, sometimes through black market arrangements. Even households received laborers. Some were teenage girls forced to serve as maids or nannies. This created a troubling truth. Forced labor was not hidden from the German public. It was part of everyday life. Many Germans saw these workers in their streets, their factories, their homes. Profit over humanity. For businesses, the equation was simple. Forced labor meant cheap labor. Workers could be paid little or nothing, housed in squalid conditions, and easily replaced. For the Nazis, this system also fit ideology, exploiting inferior peoples while strengthening the German war machine. The result was a partnership between state and industry, an alliance that turned human suffering into profit. After the war, reckoning in silence. When the war ended, the truth of industrial exploitation could not be ignored. At the Nuremberg trials, leaders of Krupp, and IG Farben faced charges for crimes against humanity. Some were convicted. Others escaped full punishment, shielded by Cold War politics as Western powers sought to rebuild Germany's economy. For decades, many companies remained silent about their wartime roles. It was not until the late 20th century that survivors pressed lawsuits demanding compensation. Even then, reparations were small compared to the profits earned during the war. A dark partnership, the role of German industry in forced labor, reveals an uncomfortable reality. The Nazi system was not built by the SS alone. It thrived because businesses cooperated, profited, and integrated slavery into the heart of the economy. Every bomb dropped on a battlefield, every tank rolling into combat, every bullet fired by a German soldier carried the fingerprints of forced laborers. Their suffering was baked into the machinery of war. And in the end, it wasn't just ideology that drove this system. It was greed, liberation, and silence. What the Allies found in 1945 as the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, Allied soldiers advancing into Germany expected fierce battles, wrecked cities, and surrendering troops. What they did not fully expect was the vast network of forced labor camps and slave barracks scattered across the land. Behind factory walls, hidden in forests, and tucked beside towns, the Allies uncovered a system of suffering that shocked even hardened veterans of war. The first encounters in April 1945. American forces entered areas of Western Germany where camps and labor sites were concentrated. British and Canadian troops moved into the north, while Soviet armies surged through the east. What they found was staggering. Emaciated men and women stumbled toward them, too weak to cheer. Children with hollow eyes hid in wooden barracks. Abandoned factories still reeked of chemicals and sweat. The machines silent, the workers gone or dead. Some soldiers later recalled that liberation was not marked by joy, but by disbelief. They had never seen such levels of starvation and cruelty. Camps turned graveyards at many sites. There was no one left to liberate. Guards had fled, leaving behind corpses unburied, or had executed prisoners before retreating. In places like Mauthausen and its subcamps, Allied troops found heaps of bodies beside exhausted survivors who could barely move. At Dachau, U.S. soldiers discovered trains filled with the dead, victims who had been transported from elsewhere, murdered by neglect and starvation. Soviet forces reaching Majdanek and later Auschwitz uncovered not only survivors, but mountains of belongings: shoes, clothes, hair, the remains of lives consumed by labor and extermination. Liberation revealed that the forced labor system was inseparable from the machinery of genocide. Work and death had always gone hand in hand. Medical crisis for the survivors. Freedom did not mean instant recovery. Many were so malnourished that Allied medics struggled to save them. Feeding too much, too quickly, sometimes killed those whose bodies could no longer handle food. Diseases like typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery spread rapidly in the overcrowded barracks. Psychological trauma was visible in every face. Fear that the guards might return, confusion about where home even was. Some survivors died within days of liberation, too far gone to be rescued. Others began slow journeys back to health, but the scars, physical and emotional, never truly healed. Displaced persons' liberation created a new crisis: millions of displaced persons. These are people torn from their homelands: Poles, Ukrainians, French, Italians, Belgians, Yugoslavs, Russians, Roma, Jews. Many had no homes to return to, their villages destroyed or occupied, their families gone. The Allies set up DP, displaced persons, camps to house them temporarily. For some, it was the first time in years they could sleep without fear. For others, it was a painful limbo, unsure if they would ever find a place to belong again. The struggle for justice, Allied authorities quickly documented what they found. Photographs, reports, and witness testimonies were gathered as evidence for war crimes trials. At Nuremberg, prosecutors presented detailed accounts of forced labor. The numbers, the suffering, the names of companies and officials who profited. The world listened in horror. And yet, justice was incomplete. While some Nazi leaders and industrialists were punished, many escaped with mild sentences or reintegrated into post-war Germany. Political necessity, especially the looming Cold War, meant that economic recovery often outweighed full accountability. Silence and forgetting for survivors. Liberation was only the beginning of another struggle to be heard. In many countries, returning forced laborers were met with silence. Some were accused of collaboration simply for surviving. Women who had endured sexual violence often stayed quiet, fearing shame or rejection. Children, too young to fully explain their experiences, carried memories into adulthood with little recognition. It took decades before many nations publicly acknowledged the scale of Nazi forced labor. In Germany itself, discussions of industrial complicity and survivor reparations remain difficult and delayed. A world confronts the truth still. The images from 1945 left a mark. Newsreels showing skeletal survivors, barracks, and camps reached audiences across the world. Ordinary citizens, who had fought the war believing it was about territory and power, suddenly saw that it was also about slavery and extermination on an industrial scale. The Allies had not just defeated an enemy. They had uncovered a crime against humanity that demanded remembrance. Liberation's bittersweet reality for those freed in 1945, liberation was a moment of relief, but also a moment of mourning. They were alive, but they were surrounded by loss. Their families were gone, their health shattered, their youth stolen. Freedom was real, but so was the silence that followed. And in that silence, survivors had to carry the weight of memory, hoping that the world would one day listen. Legacy and memory. How the world remembers Nazi forced labor when the war ended in 1945. Millions of survivors of Nazi forced labor carried their trauma home, or to places they would call home, because many never returned to their native villages. Their lives have been shattered, their youth stolen, and their families scattered or destroyed. Yet for decades, their voices were quiet. The legacy of forced labor unfolded slowly, unevenly, across nations and generations. Forgotten voices in the immediate aftermath, forced laborers often found little sympathy. In the Soviet Union, returnees from German captivity were sometimes accused of treason, viewed with suspicion for having lived under the enemy's control. Many were interrogated or even punished rather than welcomed as victims. In France and other Western countries, laborers were sometimes dismissed as weak or collaborators, their suffering overshadowed by the celebrated resistance fighters. In Germany, silence reigned. The public spoke of rebuilding cities and homes, not of acknowledging the millions of foreigners who had built that very infrastructure under chains. For survivors, this silence was its own form of wound. They carried memories that few wished to hear. The long road to recognition, it wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that serious attention turned toward forced laborers. Survivors, aging and dwindling in number, began to press lawsuits against German industries that had profited from their suffering. In 1999, after decades of legal and moral pressure, the German government and major corporations established the Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future Fund. Billions of marks were paid out as compensation to surviving forced laborers. It was late, and the amounts small compared to the profits made, but for many survivors, recognition mattered more than money. This marked a turning point. The world began to formally acknowledge the scale of Nazi forced labor and the responsibility that came with memory. Industry confronts its past for years. German companies downplayed or denied their roles. But eventually, archives opened, historians investigated, and truths came to light. Volkswagen, Siemens, BMW, and others admitted their factories had depended on forced labor. Krupp and IG Farben's crimes became case studies in the dangers of industry serving ideology. Some companies funded memorials, museums, or research to face their history openly. The reckoning was painful but necessary. Without it, history risked repeating itself. Memorials and education across Europe today, memorials stand where forced laborers once toiled. At Auschwitz, Three Monowitz, where IG Farben ran its factory, visitors walk through ruins that testify to labor turned into death. In Germany, small museums document the lives of foreign workers housed in barracks near towns and factories. School curricula now include the forced labor system as a central chapter of World War II history. Memory is not only about monuments. It is about telling stories, teaching generations, and refusing silence. The human legacy for survivors, the deepest legacy, was not financial compensation or public recognition. It was the scars left behind, bodies broken by years of hunger and overwork, families destroyed with generations missing, lifetimes haunted by nightmares of camps, overseers, and the constant fear of being replaced or killed. Some rebuilt their lives with quiet strength. Others spoke loudly, determined that the world should never forget. All carried memories that shaped their identities until the end. Lessons for today: the history of Nazi forced labor is not only about the past. It is a warning for the future. It shows how quickly ordinary businesses, farmers, and families can become complicit in exploitation. It shows how ideology and greed can combine to strip millions of people of their humanity. And it reminds us that resistance, whether through sabotage, solidarity, or survival, remains possible even under the harshest chains. Most of all, it reminds us that silence is dangerous. For too long, the world ignored these victims. Memory must ensure that such silence never returns. Closing reflection: the Nazi forced labor system was more than a side note in the war. It was the backbone of the German economy, a machine that enslaved millions, devastated lives, and left scars across continents. From the women in German kitchens to the children in fields, from the prisoners in steel mills to those who perished in factory camps, their stories are threads in the fabric of history. Today, when we speak their names, when we teach their history, when we walk through memorials and remember their pain, we honor their endurance. The world they dreamed of, a world free from chains, is the one we must continue to build. Thank you for watching this journey through the history of Nazi forced labor camps. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Keep history alive by sharing, liking, and subscribing. We tell these stories so the world never forgets. Join us for the next documentary, where we continue uncovering the untold chapters of our past. Until then, remember, history lives when we choose to remember it.